Hello. I've actually changed this talk a little bit. So I know it's been a really big, intense day full of learning. I know we're all over-caffeinated and quite tired. We have got a full hour together, and so for the next 250-odd slides, I think we can get into some... What? I'm only joking. Obviously, I'm not going to do that to you, everybody. I am delighted to confirm that this talk will be colourful and interesting. You won't need to take any notes, don't worry. It has been a long day, but what a fruitful one. Before I start waffling, can I just have a huge round of applause for both the speakers and the organisers for such an amazing day? So, as advertised, this closing session is called Just Enough to be Dangerous. So I'm going to try and take you on a journey through digital creativity and troublemaking, because I really want to talk about and demonstrate what this phrase means to me and why this kind of attitude is a core tenet of my creative practice and how you can apply it to everything that you do with technology, whether you're an artist or anything else. Depending on who you are, this might be quite a radical mindset, and that's completely fine. So what I want to get into is how you can unlock, with a little bit of knowledge and bravery, the freedom to try things out. Because I think that the bar for knowing just enough to be any of these things is really surprisingly low. And I want to show some proof in my own work. So I'm going to dig into a few of my older projects. If you've seen me talk before, you might have seen some of them, but I'm going to reframe them a little bit for today. And I think, to be honest, this retrospective is probably the last time I'm going to talk about any of this stuff on stage. So let's try and do this properly. In this talk, you will learn. Firstly, the ideas and the bold generation thereof are way more important than the technology that you choose to manifest them with. Secondly, being an expert is not on the list of things that you need in order to make big, exciting, interesting things with digital technology. Thirdly, and by far and away the best tool for the job is the one that you're going to use, the one that you like, and the one that you have access to. And finally, for extra credit, while I'm waffling, try to think about how this might apply to your own practice and your own craft. I'm not here to turn everybody into a digital artist, although that would be cool. But I do invite you to think about the word creativity in like a less literal context and apply it to whatever it is that you do with computers. So before I get started, I do want to clarify there will be a couple of points in this session where I'm going to flag a little content warning to you. I failed to do this in previous talks, and I don't want to do that again. There is a little bit of context-sensitive profanity, new band name. There are a couple of images with a little bit of blood, and there is a reason for that, it's not gratuitous, and there's a section near the end that deals with sensitive subject matter. I know we all have different tolerances, so I'll be warning you. I did have somebody faint in one of my sessions a couple of years ago, and I don't want to do that again. In fact, are you here today? No, great, okay. So who am I, and what gives me the right to stand here for an hour talking about digital creativity? Well, my name is Dan, and it's lovely to meet you. I was born in the late 1900s, and I have been making interesting things with computers since I was a teenager. I've had lots of job titles over the years. I've been a digital artist, I've been a normal artist, a game designer, a creative technologist, and more recently, I've moved into creative direction. I've got a specialism in writing and narrative design. Now, critically, I was born, raised, educated, and I'm very proudly based in the capital of the UK, which is, of course, Manchester. And woo, easy win. I wanted to mention this specifically as I'm really proud of the creative and digital culture that we've grown here in Manchester, and I feel really proud to be a part of that. And events like this are completely part of that as well. Now, I didn't study computer science. I'm not a classically trained programmer whatsoever. I did a degree in design and visual arts in the early 2000s. Back in the day, I had a full head of hair and a pocket full of dreams. And then I waited a whole 2 decades to get a master's in creative writing, so I didn't do any kind of computer science or anything like that. And I've been working for the last 20 years professionally, and often unprofessionally, in the digital arts. So currently I work as the design director and head of design at D3T. So we make big AAA video games that you might have heard of. If you're unfamiliar with the scale of things like PlayStation and Xbox games, they take hundreds of people many years to make. It's sort of like herding 200 or 300 cats across multiple time zones. And what's interesting is that everything I'm going to talk about today is a lot more lo-fi than this, but all of the attitudes that I'm going to talk about totally apply to this, where I need to be pretty okay at a whole bunch of stuff rather than a complete domain expert in 1 or 2 things. In other words, I know enough to be dangerous. I cut my teeth working at the BBC on games and apps, typically very colourful creative tech. My kids thought I made this stuff specifically for them and not for millions of other children, which is lovely. But I had to work across a lot of technologies, building games in Flash. Does anybody remember Flash? My people. I paid my rent with Flash for years. And Unity, web tech, the whole 9 yards. So right off the bat, I had to cultivate skills that were engine agnostic, and this is something that I really recommend. Whatever tech that you're into and you think you're really good at will cease to exist at some point, and you need transferable skills. Being a domain expert in something that can disappear, or in Adobe's case, become so prohibitively expensive that you can't use it, is a nightmare. So I had to have skills that transfer. And so I didn't really have time to become a super guru level and expert in anything, really. And this is a good thing. I did a stint in BBC R&D, using my skills to make cutting-edge experimental tech for broadcast. And again, acting as someone with a bit of know-how of lots of technologies really helped me here. The projects I worked on there even won a bunch of BAFTAs. I never let it go to my head. Sorry. And from there, I spent a decade working in creative tech as an independent freelancer, sort of a digital artist / creative developer. And this is the kind of stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So for example, I'm going to rattle off the kinds of things that I've made during my time. Data viz, experimental video games, stage performance, art installations, printmaking, an escape room, projection mapping, digital storybox, participatory art, Instagram bots, Twitter bots, live coding, concert visuals, gallery installations, experimental dance, collaborations, and residencies, and a lot more. So I'm not one of these people who has you know those people who have a really cool vibe and you can spot their work a mile off? I'm not one of those people. I fire in a million directions for decades, and I used to be a bit worried that was a bad thing. It isn't. So I'm usually happiest when I can do lots of bits at the same time. So for example, I built an escape room for Manchester Science Festival that needed a physical build, digital screens, game design, and narrative scripting and recording with real actors. So this is kind of my sweet spot, is having a hand in everything. I also strayed into music videos, which is a form I love. If your phone rings and someone says, "Do you want to make a music video for Daphne and Celeste in Japanese?" you say yes. And this was actually shot on site at 6 o'clock in the morning at Bury Arcade, believe it or not. They were very good sports. I've been quite mischievous too. So this piece, called By the Code of Soil, was an installed project for my friend and collaborator, Cassia Mulga. And we coded it to secretly install a second project on the hard drives of hundreds of people. And it activated a strange audio-visual experimental artwork, and it was triggered by satellites passing overhead wherever you were in the world. And it turns out you can do quite a lot with NASA APIs and a willingness to annoy people. I've also done a lot of live performance through my live coding practice. I was involved in the algo-rave movement, so that's algo as in algorithm, and rave as in rave. A lot of this culminates in writing code at 2 a.m. in nightclubs to make techno music and visual art, using nothing but open source software and algorithms. If you haven't written live code, you know how hard it is to write when someone's looking over your shoulder? Imagine like 500 dancing people looking over your shoulder when you're trying to write. It's a nightmare. And of course, if the worst person on earth doesn't like what you do, you're probably onto a winner. It's also worth saying that the vibrant artwork in the background of a lot of these slides was all taken from my live performance, and it was all created on the fly, live in front of an audience. No pressure. Now, all of the projects in this talk, all the stuff I've just shown you and everything I'm going to show you, shares the same core trait. Everything is built on relatively straightforward, readily available, and typically open source technology. This simplicity is a choice. Don't get me wrong, I am an experienced battle-hardened engineer. I can make complicated things if I need to. That's what I do by day. But in other words, I don't need to be working at the cutting edge in order to facilitate rapid experimentation. I need to have a willingness to fail quickly and iterate and all that stuff. Sometimes you just need enough knowledge to be creative and start. So what I see over and over is people losing their minds about not knowing everything or being scared to begin because they assume that the barrier to entry is incredibly high. So you end up in this kind of situation where you are paralyzed by worry and stressed about all the technology and all the options and everything else, and you kind of get in your own way, you know? And instead, what you need to do is step back, have a brew, get some perspective. And the trick to being good with digital tech, I have found, is figuring out the baseline of what you can get away with in order to express the idea. Try that out, then assess. If it needs a little more, you can build on it. Like, how do you eat an elephant? Anybody know? One bite at a time. But Dan, some of you more serious people are going to be saying, are you not suggesting that everybody just makes rubbish work and stops caring about code quality and good engineering? Hands up, anybody thinking that? You're not going to admit it, I know it's fine. No, obviously there are lots of instances where I would prefer you to be a domain expert. Obviously, I'm not talking about everybody. If you write aircraft control systems, if you work in a bank, or as I literally spoke to someone who writes firmware for pacemakers, please don't listen to a single thing that I say in this talk. But obviously, there is a time and a place for deep domain knowledge. You know, I'm a generalist at work, but there are people that I work with who are absolute experts in their craft, and we need those too. But I'm trying to talk about a generalist approach. So yeah, if any of these are you, don't email me. I know. But we are in, and I bang on about this a lot, we're in a golden age of access to digital tools and the resources and the knowledge to get going with them. And it's something that we really take for granted, I think. And it seems so obvious to state that we don't need computer science degrees and expensive equipment to make anything anymore. And all you need nowadays is the idea and the energy and motivation to see it through. And I find that incredibly exciting. The world is your oyster. Pop quiz. What's the best programming language to learn right now? Just shout out. Python? Nope. Anybody else? English. English. Programming language? I think JavaScript? No. The right answer is whichever one you like, within reason. If there is an environmental tool that you enjoy, or you've got a friend that knows it really well, or you happen to have a book about it on your desk, generally that's like 80% of the battle. If it's something that you know that you're going to want to use. People get very hung up on technology choices. And personally, as long as it does the job, it generally doesn't, within reason, doesn't really matter what you've chosen, as long as you want to use it and you can get results in it. So what I'm talking about here is, and I'm going to end up in a fight because of this, but I do want to put it in, is the human creative process. And this is about experimentation and mistakes and unexpected moments of creative lightning that are part of exploring new and exciting things, right? So I'm often asked, isn't AI a better way to be productive and successful with creative tech? No. So just allow me to be unambiguous here. For the record, I am speaking personally, I don't want to get fired, and I'm talking in the context of digital creativity and generative AI. I don't believe there's an ethical, technical, or creative justification for using generative AI in place of human creativity whatsoever. I'm not saying I'm wholesale against AI. I am saying that if I went back in time, got a PhD, joined NASA, I'd like to be involved in having Sam Altman fired directly into the heart of the sun. But he's going to have me killed. But if you're putting prompts into a machine and suggesting you've made anything of human creative value, I just want you to listen to this talk, jokes aside, and think really carefully about why it is that we create in the first place. That's my point. So let's talk about human creativity. I believe that you just need enough to express your ideas, and you can do so with surprisingly straightforward technology. And once you free yourself of the shackles of worrying constantly if you're doing it right, or you're at the cutting edge, or whatever else, you can focus on what you're trying to say and what you're trying to do. Because I can assure you, almost nobody gives a shit what technology you used to make that thing, as long as the thing does what you want it to do. So allow me to illustrate. I had a really good partnership with a brilliant artist called Naho Matsuda on a project called Everything, Every Time. We began our participation on a Future Everything, RIP, artist development program that blossomed into a few works. And they're basically data-driven ruminations, like poems that talk about the city around them. So I'm showing this project because it was incredibly technologically simple. The poetry is the center point, and the way we generated it is also very straightforward. And it's worth saying that the physical form of this work did change. So we started with these bus signs, and then we turned it into these full kind of site-specific expressions of it, I guess, through an amazing tech house called Rascal. They use split flap displays, and these are flip dot displays off a bus sign. I've still got one in my house, and they're amazing, and they make the best noise ever. Inside the machine is, of course, a Raspberry Pi. There's some Python to control the physical display. And basically what happens is it talks to a web service that I made that asks for a poem and displays it. Now, all the code is very simple JavaScript. It doesn't do anything clever, but what it does do is construct poems in a really curated way, designed to reflect what Naho wanted to do in a very human sense. So the poetry is drawn from what the sign knows about its location, the current time, the date, events happening nearby, statistics, some external data sets, and so on. It does hundreds and hundreds of little requests and then builds a poem from it. We also do a layer of inferring. So for example, we can talk about things like the street lights because we know what time it is, we know when the sun sets, and we know that we're in an urban location, for example. So you can infer lots of things from data that you've got available. This version was installed in Newcastle, where there are lots of pubs. And this is kind of gross, but it remains the only artwork I've ever deployed that someone pissed on. Public art is not glamorous, and for future reference, I would strongly recommend a good sealant on your joins. Every single poem also gets pushed to a database, which had a really nice side effect. People kept asking for poems for specific moments in time, including a guy who asked for a poem that was displaying when his first child was born, which was great because we could do it and we sent it to him. So again, not complicated or clever, just thoughtful use of technology. This work went all over the UK and all over the world. It went as far as Texas for South by Southwest, which was this version, and Doha in Qatar, seen here. And of course, every time you move it, the poetry changes because the data it has access to is different, and the shape and the timing of everything is new. So the resulting poetry is fundamentally changed. So how do you make a poem out of data? Let's have a look. So here's a sample of the files that generate the lines of poetry. The whole system sits in the cloud, which sounds really complicated, but it's made of the same stuff that websites are made of. That's all it is. I made hundreds of these over the run of the work. There's a core set of poetry, and then we added data sets for each location. These files are tiny. They're like 5 or 6 lines of very rudimentary JavaScript. Even the most novice programmer would be able to understand it. So I'm a big believer in making things where you reduce the bus number. Does anybody know what the bus number is? So it's how many developers could get hit by a bus before you can't do your project anymore. So you don't want that bus number to be bad. So here's how it works. At regular intervals, the sign will say, hey, it's time for a new poem, like every couple of minutes. It will send a request to the generator, and the algorithm will pick random data sets to write poetry about. In this case, a cat, mosque, metro, baby, and festival. We can infer lots of things. So the cat poem we can talk about because we know it's daytime and we know we're in a hot country. The mosque, we know the opening times. We have access to an API for the metro. We know about birth rate statistics for this particular location, and we scraped the festival website. And what you end up with is a little poem that expresses a little fragment in time. And it does this hundreds and hundreds of times all day, and the poems change as the data and timing changes and everything else. So as an example, the poetry in the same place in the daytime intrinsically talks about action and population and life, and the data paints a picture of movement and bustle because that is what happens when you pull in enough reference point. Conversely, the same sign in the same location at nighttime paints a muted and quiet picture. So it's the same data, the same approach, but it's completely different framing, all delivered with a little bit of JavaScript and a can-do attitude. So knowing enough to be dangerous also means knowing enough to be confident and curious. A little bit of knowledge is enough to start being experimental and trying things out. And I do say experimental in a very literal sense. I don't mean like in an art sense. I mean that armed with enough knowledge to try things, you can start pushing against the boundaries of your creativity, whatever your field. When we set out on the path to learning something, we're terrified beginners, and that's totally fine. We ask questions like these. Knowing enough to be dangerous just means dropping these concerns and worrying about things being right, and instead beginning to ask, what's the coolest thing I can do with this? Like, can I combine this thing and this thing to make something new? Can I bend this thing into a new shape? And if you do this, you also notice that these grumpy sort of internet neckbeard types that tell you you're doing it wrong, they recede into the distance, which is a lovely side effect because you're doing it. I don't have time for that kind of person, and neither should you. So I wanted to show you this project specifically because it sums up a lot of this ethos. Moving quickly, being bold, learning things new, learning new interesting things with straightforward tech. But it also illustrates that the idea and the human practice at the center of something is way more important than everything else. So I was asked to participate in an on-site residency in Lahore in Pakistan with MadLab and the British Council. So I spent a lot of time really thinking about what I was going to do, and I started to focus in on Islamic geometric design. So this is creating intricate, beautiful forms from nothing but shapes and logic found in art, architecture, and thousands of other contexts. Obviously, it's worth saying that I dipped my toe into this from the perspective of a Western computer programmer trying to seek cultural exchange, let's say. People spend their entire lives studying and honing this craft, and I will not profess to be anything other than a glancing visitor in this space. So step one was just to research and immerse. For younger audience members, these are called books. They're kind of like printed Wikipedia pages, very, very handy. I would say about 80% of this work that I did, it's a digital project. 80% of the work that I did was by hand, even though the final piece was a digital projected version. The aim was to create this digital installation that bridged the gap and expressed my take on exploring and learning these forms. So learning the fundamentals is absolutely key. So my house started to fill with this stuff as I grew in confidence. Again, barely scratching the surface in terms of complexity. But as a beginner learning something new, I'm not just talking about programming languages, I'm talking about anything. It feels like you're sticking your head into a whole new universe. And these forms emerge using only a compass and a ruler. It's absolutely incredible. And as I worked, the sketches got bigger and more complex, and I reached a point where I go, oh, I'm going to start exploring this digitally now. As a side effect of being paid to absolutely obsess over something very specific, my family thought I'd gone mental at this point. Those who know me will know that I tend to cultivate creative obsessions and let them consume me. I'm currently learning how to knit. Do you know what knitting patterns are? They're algorithms. And I get a jumper at the end, so, you know. Anyway, if this is the kind of thing that resonates with you, I heartily recommend becoming a wandering digital artist. Well, as long as you hate money as well. Anyway, I began to shift into digital tech. So these early outputs look almost identical to my hand sketches, completely by design. I used processing for this work, which is, of course, open source, incredibly simple, but quite powerful programming language, geared for digital creativity. And the reason I chose it is that it's free and open source, and it's got a wealth of learning resources and a community around it. Like that is my sole selection criteria for this kind of thing. Can I speak to people when I need a hand? That kind of idea. And I also tend to keep images and copies of everything, including the errors. Every project I do has a folder called offcuts, and it's just full of screenshots and outputs that I treat as part of the learning process. So for example, these popped out while I was messing around with it, and although they're, air quotes, wrong, they're also aesthetically pleasing and illustrate what I was experimenting with at this point in time. And in fact, a couple of years later, I went back to Pakistan, Karachi this time, and produced a load of live on-site watercolor paintings that degraded and glitched out intentionally over time, partially inspired by the broken outputs that I'd accidentally created a couple of years before. So you never know when something is just going to light up for you. It's really, a part of creativity I love is surprise. Authenticity is important, or at least doing my best at the time that I had, so I was pulling in colors and textures and patterns from the real world. Again, nothing complex. I'm sampling colors in Photoshop, making palettes, changing the code to pick them at random. Not everything has to be cutting edge. It just has to be enough to do the job and be more pleasing to the eye. And the end result was that I had a homemade generator that could basically run forever. So, code ready, I packed a big suitcase full of kit and hit the road. If anybody wants to know how hard it is getting 30 meters of shielded HDMI cable, 2 cameras and a tripod through international customs, the answer is unbelievably difficult. Really, I barely had any clothes, just loads of cable. Not great. So, hit the road, flew over, climbed these stairs to where the projector was. I'm not actually sure at what angle a ladder becomes stairs, but I basically nearly died here about 50 times. I'm not even joking. Everything was very DIY. Projector was mounted on top of a building and attached to a metal frame that someone had specially welded together. Please note the load-bearing sticks under the projector mount here. Like, the entire festival hinged on these sticks. It was great. And then my laptop and the projector and everything else was wired into this kind of infrastructure. I was getting static electric shocks the whole time, which really, really keeps you on your toes. But as the sun set in Lahore, we fired it up. This is projected high on the side of the building, loads of people out of the shot. This is a time lapse, obviously. And the full patterns at full speed are quite slow and ponderous, and the whole thing was very relaxed. I also left a lot of the construction lines in on purpose, so dialed it up so you could see my kind of working methodology. And I also had to recode a lot of this on the rooftop, which was a nightmare. Now, one thing to consider when you're being all excited and freewheeling with the new thing that you're learning is knowing enough to fix things. Because errors, no matter how good you get, are an inevitability. No matter how clever you think you are or how experienced, there will always be bugs in your code. And if you're working on something that's so complex or so hastily thrown together that you can't fix it, you are in for a world of trouble. So I present to you as a cautionary tale me fixing a bug in my code live on the side of a building in Pakistan with a ton of people watching. And this is a time lapse as well, so you can't hear me swearing at my computer. Okay, so one of the other aspects to knowing just enough to be dangerous is cultivating enough confidence to know that you don't always have to reinvent the wheel or build from scratch. Sometimes creative confidence is about understanding what you can take off the shelf or combine it with other new things. And it's actually vanishingly rare that digital projects don't pull in libraries or resources or code or environments from other places or projects. We're all standing on the shoulders of giants. So just to illustrate this concept, there was a second piece of work that I did in Pakistan. So there's a huge number of canals and waterways out there, and I wanted to respond to those by bringing flowing water into the festival space, so something that the audience would be surprised to see. So I found and modified a fluid simulation system, an open source one. And this sounds really complex, and it is under the hood. People will do PhDs in fluid simulations, but I just know enough to be dangerous. And what that means is I can just take it because somebody has open sourced it, plug it into a camera, figure out who's walking through the liquid, and make the liquid work. I don't need to understand how the whole thing works. I just need to know enough to plug it together, you know?
Nerd.
The movement is basically transferred into the water, which is great. We used a Kinect sensor to track movement. Every digital artist worth their salt has a whole box of these things because they're great. They work in the dark, so this is built for nighttime, so I just needed something that can see when people are moving. Again, the code for this is written by somebody vastly smarter than me and shared openly, meaning that it just becomes another building block for my project. I don't need to know how it functions in order to use it, much the same as I don't really know the exact intricacies of how my car works, but I can use it, you know? So here's a video of me testing it. can see the fluid reacting to my movement speed, and the Kinect is hiding at the back on the tripod there. The final piece of the puzzle is that we ran the whole thing through projection mapping software, so we mapped it to the physical floor tiles, so it kind of fades into the background a little bit, and people just encountered it. And of course, because we're on site in Pakistan, people just continually rode motorbikes through it, and that also worked, which was great. And yeah, so part of this experimentation is being unafraid to try stuff out. So I also built systems like this that were looking, basically it tracked a person looking at it, and you had to stand in front of it and really stay still and regard it in order for the thing to coalesce. So it gets neater the more central and still you are, and if you walk past it, you can't see it properly. Didn't use it, went in the bin, but it's part of the process, and I keep everything, you know? My laptop's having a terrible time. It goes zapped in Pakistan. So as a final note here, all of these projects are made possible by shared open source software. So this is code and libraries and tools that other people have written and shared. That when you know enough to be ready to share your own work, this is something I strongly encourage you to do so, because it means that you become part of an ecosystem. You will make building blocks for other people to use and build and learn from. And without other people doing that, I wouldn't be able to create what I do. The code for my project is always openly shared, as you can see from the GitHub project here. That's all the code from the Lahore project. And I actually use a permissive, bordering on confrontational software license called the do what the fuck you want to public license, which is a single clause. This is a bit facetious, obviously, but for me, this is a provocation. Take this thing I made and do something cool with it. I've got nothing to gain by keeping it to myself. Take it and run with it, right? So you also don't need to be an expert in your technologies in order to roll the dice or take a big swing at something. So I've created projects that are made of almost no code, but have other aspects that make things work. And in these instances, knowing enough to be dangerous is the springboard, but sometimes you just got to take a deep breath and be brave about your ideas. Now, trigger warning here. If you are squeamish, this section has a couple of gross slides. I'm going to warn you appropriately, and I'll tell you when we're past them. For everybody else, strap in. So, I did a lot of work with the Open Data Institute, so Sir Tim Berners-Lee's Open Data Institute, never met him. They had a long history of curating and exhibiting quite provocative artworks, but it's in their physical space in London, so it's a working space full of people, not a gallery. So very, very interesting dynamic to me. I'd already participated in a couple of exhibitions for them, including works that experimented with time and chronology. So the work on the left here shows 5 minutes of live performance, but as a print. And then the thing on the right was a screen that was installed for a whole year, and it showed 2 hours of my practice, but over 365 days. So people in the space were just continually haunted by the weird stuff that was over their shoulder, which is great. And at the time, the then Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, was making a lot of really stupid, misinformed proclamations in the press, suggesting that you can control encryption, or there was a lot of scaremongering, and the idea that she doesn't need to know how it works in order to know that it's bad. Vote for me, bollocks. Obviously, as both a digital artist and technologist, this was preposterous to me, and so I set about creating a digital work that encrypted some information really easily, but ideally done in a provocative way, because, you know, art. So I did the logical thing and turned up at the ODI building with 2 enormous canvases, loads of paint, and several encrypted messages that I had put together using very, very little code. And yes, Amber Rudd, it's very possible to securely encrypt some information, even with the most rudimentary grasp of technology. It's fine. I cannot write encryption code. I don't recommend anybody ever rolls their own, but I know enough to understand and trust this tech to the extent that I felt totally confident making massive paintings of my encrypted technology, encrypted secrets, done with technology. So I made a few of these. One of them contains my bank details, and one of them contains my darkest secret, and I felt fully confident because that's how encryption works. I actually wanted to send these to Amber Rudd, to her office. And I was advised very specifically and very strongly that this sort of thing results in you being put on a list. So I spent a few days making them. I didn't send them to Amber Rudd, but they did go up in the office. I think they're in a university in Edinburgh now, I want to say. So here are my secrets. They're encrypted securely. Remember, the tech is not complex. I just know enough to do it. And I was able to lean on industry strength technology to do the hard work. Now, this kind of encryption requires a key to decrypt, some of which I memorized, so it's quite secure, and the rest was a big long text string that I needed to store somewhere secure. It's a small fragment of text that, when combined with the part that I know, becomes the key to unlocking the message. So the question then arises, where can I store the key, so I always know where it is, that's also symbolically striking as a piece of art? If you answered, put it on an implant and stab it into my hand, 10 points. So this is the gross bit. So this is a surgical RFID implant. It's shown to scale with a coin, so you can see kind of how small it is. It's a little glass tube, and it contains an RFID wireless transponder, so a tiny bit of onboard memory, similar to like a key card, like a wireless key card. They're mostly sold by this company called Dangerous Things, ironically, for this talk. Sure, I can trust them. And I'm going to let you read the small print. So basically, try it, but if your hand falls off, that's on you, man. So here's what it looks like on their website. It's a sterile injection assembly with the chip inside it. And it doesn't look too scary when you see this image. No problem. I went to a friend of mine, a licensed body modification specialist. He's a body piercer. You can't just do this yourself, because that would be reckless, relatively speaking. And this is my photo. So at this point, I started to get a bit nervous. I'm covered in tattoos. I've had lots of piercings. I'm not generally bothered about needles, but this is a big needle. So at this point, I am sweating bullets, but didn't want to let him know. But I'd already done the paintings. I had to go through with this, right? Like, I'd written my artist statement. So I took a deep breath and said, okay, let's do it. And he was like, get in the chair. So on the image here, you can see the target for the needle. So the little dot on the right-hand side is the insertion point, and then the line is where the implant is supposed to sit. So in the interest of science, who would like to see it go in? Oh, yeah. So the next 2 slides contain the needle and the blood. I will tell you when they're finished. If you need to cover your eyes, please do so. We clean the site. It's basically a piercing, but doesn't come out the other side. Take a deep breath. Needle goes in. There's a bit of rummaging around to find the right spot. This was incredibly painful for about 5 seconds, and then it was completely over. It was really weird. Chip went in. Blood came out. And it's worth saying, within a couple of hours, it literally stopped hurting completely, and within a day, I'd forgotten I had it done. I went to soft play with my kids the next day and completely forgot it was fine. So I fundamentally disagree with anybody who writes for Wired, saying that we're all going to have these. It's just nonsense. I'm here on the Venn diagram. Yeah. So in the short term, it was really interesting. So my brain was really unhappy about the implant. I've had plenty of piercings, but the implant specifically, because it stays, my brain was very unhappy. And I kept having dreams about finding it in different places, like on my face or on my leg. It was really strange. And I'm pleased to report that it's been nearly 10 years, and it hasn't been for a swim around my circulatory system anywhere, which has been great. I've been through, people always ask, oh, can you go through airport scanners? Yes. Can you have x-rays? Yes. I've been into mosh pits, and I've had my hand stood on. I was skateboarding and fell over. Like, they're fine. They're very, if you damage it, you've got bigger things to worry about than the chip, like, such as your hand, which is made of squishy stuff. So you can read the data wirelessly with a smartphone. I've used it to unlock my laptop. I've used it to clone hotel room keys. I'm hoping this video works, because it's great. I think you get it. Oh, man. I can't believe I'm standing here showing you this. All right, so I've shown you a lot of work which I think illustrates my ethos, all of which were planned arts activities where I had a bit of runway to get my plan together. But I also wanted to explain that sometimes you can use digital tech in ways you don't expect as well. And sometimes an opportunity, or in this case, a problem space, will present itself to you, good or bad. And because you have a little confidence, you can be better equipped to respond to it. In other words, sometimes just being able to get to the heart of your idea without wasting time learning everything can mean a lot. So just to be crystal clear here, although I've joked around a lot during this session, the next few slides will be a bit more serious. Like many people in Manchester and beyond, my trajectory as a person was altered unexpectedly during the attack at the Manchester Arena. I actually know that this event happened as scheduled quite a short time later, which I think is just amazing. It's just wonderful. And in fact, the poetry project that I did was only 3 weeks afterwards as well. So the fact that things like this continue to happen afterwards is just the best thing ever. So this was my first interaction with any of it, firing off an annoyed tweet at 11 p.m. without knowing myself what had happened. And I pressed send and went to bed. 12 hours later, I'd learned what had happened. It became apparent that my younger brother Martin had been at the show and hadn't checked in. And from this point onwards, the next few days were just a whirlwind of chaos and emotion and stress. I remained as glued to the news as everybody else. And as time went on, I found myself being taken at over 100 miles an hour in a police car to the Etihad Stadium, where the families had gathered waiting for news. It's the worst day of any of our lives, and Martin was identified as one of the 22 victims that day. I went home, and nothing was ever the same. So life was turned upside down in a way that I struggle to articulate, and going through all of this grief and loss, but doing so in an incredibly public way, was something that nobody could possibly prepare for. And personally, I got fairly embroiled in the way that the deaths had been used and co-opted by the far right, for example, and used the platform that I'd been put on to speak my mind on it, within a week. This culminated in the biggest talk I've ever done in my life at TEDx at the Bridgewater Hall to 2,500 people talking about extremism and why we need to talk to the right people about extremism. To give you an idea, I was talking to somebody backstage before. I was so nervous during this talk that somebody handed me a presentation clicker before I walked onto the stage. I didn't even have any slides. It was ridiculous. It was terrifying, but important. Now, the reason I'm telling you all of this is that my response as a person was obviously immediate and profound and intense. And in going through this experience, or rather hundreds of experiences, my creativity had also been invariably changed. And the responses are different in nature, but they're completely linked. And I began to write. I've always written, as the cliche goes, but this was different. I felt that I had to capture everything before it left my head. I had a bit of experience working with interactive fiction. For the uninitiated, this is a fiction form that you can play through. So you choose a path and you move through different versions of the same story. You like choose your own adventure kind of idea. I realized that this form, and I never intended to release any of this to the public, I just did it because I wanted to capture things, was a really good way to write not just about what happened, but about what didn't happen, about the what-ifs. So the resulting project, named See You Later, after one of my brother's last texts, contains no identifying information. So if you know me or my story, you'll know what it's about, but if not, you can still have a meaningful exploration of something. And because the experience I was forced through wasn't a big thing, it was lots of little decisions all happening at once, this worked really well. Like, do I get in the police car or not? Do I speak to this man breaking down in the hallway or not? Do I go and sit outside in the stadium where we were waiting or stay inside? And so much of my thought process while dealing with all of this was, what would have happened if I'd done something different? What if? So critically, there is only one path through this work and thousands of possible paths that reflect the actual journey and the decisions I took and didn't take. Everything else is what if. And you can kind of see where my head was at. And again, I start by hand, even when I'm in a rush to just get something out. So this was the plan that I made before moving into writing. Everything for me requires some semblance of planning. I chose Twine to make this project. So as with all of the other stuff I've shown you, it's a tool that I favor because it's quick, it's simple, it's free, and it's completely accessible. It's tools like this, for me, that have democratized creative tech because anybody can use it. You can run Twine on a toaster if you want, and you can learn how to use it. I teach kids how to use Twine in 1 hour. I can teach a room full of grown-ups who had been drinking how to use Twine, so that's always the litmus test for accessibility for me. And it really does work everywhere. If you have a story to tell, you can use stuff like Twine to do it and put it online within minutes of learning it. And that's really important. I didn't want the tech to get in the way. I just needed to get this done. So the work took on a life of its own, and the form really resonated with people. The notion that you could use something like a video game to get an experience across to people really sparked a lot of discussion and interest. This culminated in it winning the New Media Writing Prize. It was covered in the press. It was in an exhibition and a collection at the British Library. And all of this came from this free, tiny Twine game that was just a raw expression of something that I made in one weekend with no editing. There's no complexity in this work, just a meaningful thing that I wanted to put out into the world with urgency. I made a few other games as part of this whole experience. Although I was clearly working through some specific stuff in See You Later, there were other aspects that were completely unique or challenging for me. And again, using very basic tech with a good idea, or in this case, a good motivation, at the center was all I needed to have an impact. In this case, the press intrusion was an aspect that really underpinned the experience all the way through. And when I say from the beginning, I mean literally, there were journalists posting notes like this under my door before I'd even found out what had happened to my brother, okay? So the visibility and the intensity was just off the charts. I didn't have much agency at the time to comment on it because I was experiencing it, but a year or two later I began to think quite critically about the role the press had played in everything and just how awful it can be. We're going through deep trauma as a family, and journalists have filled every inbox that I was connected to, and I had to take my website contact form offline for a year and stop answering the phone. It was a nightmare. So I did what I thought was right and made a game about it. And I did this to try and articulate to people what the thing felt like, albeit in a cheeky sort of lo-fi kind of way. Again, this is a straightforward project built in a couple of days using open source tech. Runs in a web browser. It's a few hundred lines of code, done. It's called Sorry to Bother You, and you play as me. Just does this. So messages come in. You must like or delete messages depending on whether they are real messages of concern or thinly veiled journalist requests. The game contains hundreds of messages, and it's intentionally unwinnable. They mount up so quickly that you can't possibly process them all. You fail every time. And the kicker, of course, is that every single message in this game was taken verbatim from my phone, WhatsApps and texts and my inbox and email. I took out the numbers, and in they went. Now, people engaged with this quite interestingly, and it did what I wanted. It caused people, particularly those in the press, to look inward. Now, this isn't an anti-press thing wholesale. I use my platform in the press plenty in lots of ways, but it looked at a particularly direct and unethical approach style that people in traumatic situations experience so strongly, particularly in this country, I think. And there were articles later by journalists examining themselves a little bit, and most interestingly of all, I had a few DMs from people apologizing for the way in which they reached out. And I thought it was curious that in a couple of cases, it was the first message they sent me since hassling me the night of the arena attack. So the game was also picked up by the Hacked Off campaign, which was set up by Hugh Grant and others in response to things like the phone hacking scandal, so it's talking about the same sort of stuff. And they agreed, even as non-games people, that sometimes the best way to get something across to somebody is to make them experience it and think about it, even in a relatively throwaway manner. And despite everything, despite all of my work and qualifications and my carefully curated internet presence, my annoying, dickhead younger brother would have been delighted to know that throughout this, I was referred to as exactly one job title, brother of mine. Absolutely infuriating. So all of this small work, and this was really, really rapid work, led to bigger things. And that's what knowing enough to be dangerous means. You can act quickly, but these things can grow, and this is how you plant seeds, right? And so years later, I began to question bigger things, not just about myself and my own experiences, but much bigger ones, around societal level questions, around extremism and the effects and causes. So I directed and wrote this much larger text game called Closed Hands. It was obviously drawn from my experiences, but completely fictional. It examines the lead-up and aftermath of a fictional terror attack, but it's never depicted directly. It doesn't talk about the attack, just the lead-up and the aftermath. It's fictional, it's the perspectives of 5 intertwined characters, and it was big enough that I had to put a studio together to do it. It's 130,000 words, full artwork, soundtrack, and the whole 9 yards. Talking about this project is basically a talk in its own right, but you can play it for free online, give it a whirl. And my writing on the subject spiraled out into lots of other directions too, including this draft script directly related to my interactive work. So this was 6 episodes, or proposed episodes, of a drama script for Sky. They didn't bite in the end, but the twist for this was very games influenced. You can watch the episodes in any order and see the events from 6 different perspectives, and you replay them from different viewpoints. And again, all of this grew from those tiny little fragments of a project that I never expected to make. So yeah, sadly this never saw the light of day, but it did show me that sometimes, once you know enough to be dangerous, those little experiments can cascade into much bigger things. Oh, and by the way, I added this slide back in after seeing Rachel's talk this morning about hope. A lot of this work does come from hope and a desire to make our technology and platforms better. So I had a chance to ask the then Twitter CEO, Jack Dorsey, to his face, what he was doing about the teeming mass of fascists he'd grown on Twitter, and I didn't get a good answer. Right. So, sorry, that was a mountain of talking, and it got a bit heavy there. I'm sorry, I hope you don't mind. So let's wrap this up. I promised at the start I would attempt to impart some kind of structured wisdom, and if I've given you any lessons here, please at least take these away. Absolutely critically, always resist the urge to spend too much time stressing about the ins and outs of the actual technology. There is no substitute for a killer idea, and the implementation part, as we've discussed quite a lot today, is completely secondary. Let the concept drive the execution, not the other way around. In other words, I want to know what the story is that you're writing. I don't care what color the notebook is. Secondly, you don't need to be an expert to use the latest cutting-edge tools, or even use those tools correctly in order to be impactful and powerful and bold and a million other things. Don't allow yourself to become paralyzed by stupid concerns like doing it correctly. If it works, you're doing it correctly, and no nerd on the internet is allowed to shut you down. And I've had this for years, I used to hear vastly better programmers than me say things like, I could have done that, but you didn't. Remember that we are in a golden age of free and available tech and resource. Just start, you'll figure it out. Similarly, the very best language or tech to use is the one that you want to use. Uncountable time is wasted comparing and stressing. Just pick something that sparks joy and get going. I love JavaScript because it's open and ubiquitous. I like text adventures in Twine because it's simple and fast. I like games made in Love 2D because they have a cute logo with a love heart. So, all right, maybe not the last thing, but you get what I mean, right? And above all, if you take nothing else from this ludicrous waffle that I've subjected you to, know this to be true, because I'm hoping that I've proved it. No matter what it is you do with computers, whether it's making art or designing systems or anything else, in order to make meaningful and impactful and interesting and valuable work, you just don't need to know everything. You just need enough to be dangerous. I've been Dan Hett. Thank you very much.
So good, right? I told you this was going to be a good one, right? Are you happy to do a couple of questions?
I certainly am. I'm going to step out from behind my podium.
Let's take a couple of questions. Kat's have you got the mic down there as well? Okay, there's a few questions up here. I'll do this side.
Oh, it's like Challenge Annika, isn't it?
Hello, over here. Hi.
Sorry. Yep.
It's okay. Thank you so much for creating See You Later. It was just an incredible and horrible and huge experience, and I can't thank you enough for it. My question is, how do you keep creating such open, vulnerable work despite the fact that there's a bunch of people on the internet that are going to be cruel and are going to be just daft and not get it in really frustrating, rage-inducing ways? How do you not let that change you, and how do you stay creative in spite of that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's two parts of it. So the initial work, the motivation there that supersedes everything else was just the need to have it out into the world and to transmit. You know, it's the same reason that people write or anything, or write music or whatever else. I'm not a musician. I'm not a painter usually, but I do make video games, and so that became the outlet for me. And you know, critically, they were given away. I didn't sell them. I didn't, you know, the only point of the exercise was to give them away, and so that was my justification, and that really shuts people down. The Closed Hands project, for example, because that was a fiction project, and we sold it for like a £5 or something, and I actually caught a lot of flack for that, which was really annoying. And the point of it was to explore and be honest and truthful and everything else. Ultimately, people helped me make it, and they have mouths to feed and whatnot. But really, a lot of it is just a desire to put something into the world and have it done. And I felt that if I was, how do I phrase it? Yeah, that honesty is important in the work, you know, and it's not the kind of work that you do forever. All of this happened really quickly. It was a knee-jerk, get it into the world thing. So sometimes I think you just have to be brave, and there's plenty of people. Twine is a really good example. There are people all over the world making really, like, sometimes brutal or very introspective or very open or arresting games in Twine, because they're not computer programmers. They're just people with stories to tell, and part of that was my inspiration, really.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
Kat, just further down.
That was fantastic. Can I just say, what's next for you?
So basically, I'm full-time now. I make video games full-time. So I'm a design director on video games. The problem is, everything's NDA'd, and I can't tell anybody what I work on until it's out. And they also take years to make, so these things. I'm working on something at the moment. It will be out in 3 years, and I can't tell you one thing about it. And I think I joke about it a lot, but I've made my peace with the fact that I think freewheeling digital creativity, like the stuff I've shown you, I joked about the money, and there is a practical concern that existing on Arts Council funding and bits and bobs is just not a way to, that is a direct criticism of the systems that we've got in place and of the political parties that have eviscerated the systems that artists rely on in this country. I just could not, and I'm more privileged than most. You know, I'm a Western middle class male. I've got all of the starts, but I still can't do the funding thing, you know, and I've had plenty of support that a lot of people don't have. So simply, to answer the question, I no longer do any of this stuff actively because it doesn't pay the bills. And that's horrible to have to say, but that is the truth. And there's a lot of dialogue at the moment in the arts in the UK, rightly so, about why people like me no longer make creative work and have to go into full-time jobs. I like my job, but I now do a 9 to 5, you know, and that is a direct result of the fact that I can't sustain creative practice independently anymore, which is terrible. So take it up with the Tories, and go and vote today, by the way. Go fix it. Okay, anybody else?
Any other questions? One just here. Get my steps in today, don't I?
Oh, we're making you work today, sorry.
Hi there. Firstly, amazing talk. Thank you so much. Secondly, it's lovely to hear MadLab mentioned. Thirdly, for my question, how do you identify what's like a reasonable project for you to pick up that, you know, you can actually accomplish? So you say go and play and just explore, but how do you identify, that's something that I can have a lot of fun with and not drive myself insane, and I'll actually maybe get finished?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I guess the stuff that I talked about was the stuff that just lights me up creatively. Like, obviously, the personal work stuff, my motivation was just to get it out into the world. But the stuff I did in Pakistan was just new. I think, and what I never try to do, I don't want to do stuff that's been done, and I think one of the biggest wastes I see is when you've got someone who's really talented, who does the same thing over and over again. Like, there are some artists where you see their work and you're just like, that is unmistakably that person, and they've been doing the same thing for 20 years, and maybe it makes them loads of money or whatever. And for me, that is the opposite of what I want from creativity and a creative practice. I want to be challenged, and I want to be surprised, and I want to learn. You know, the Pakistan thing was just pure learning for me, and then a little digital expression at the end of it. And that, for me, is the sweet spot. And I think that applies whether you're doing creative arts or you're learning a new platform or whatever. Like, that is a motivation that it never goes away. And I even get that at work sometimes. Like, it's just that desire to grab something new and just stick your head into it and absorb it is just such a pleasure and a gift, you know? And that's genuinely my motivation.
One more, I think.
Time for one more little one.
Hiya.
Hey.
That was an incredible talk with so many layers. So thank you. Yeah, and thank you for sharing everything. Two, so one of the things that you mentioned was how a really tragic event was weaponized by a far-right narrative. And since then, it feels like on many levels things have got even worse with the hostility and the scapegoating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to hear from you, you know, what you've learned from your talks and your work in this space, and any words of wisdom that you have for us in the climate that we're in at the minute.
Man, that's a big question that transcends creativity and is just into how do we fix this? I mean, for example, the reason I did the TED Talk, to be honest, I would watch that because it gives a really good answer, and it's only 15 minutes. And basically, my core point in that talk was that we're speaking to the wrong people about extremism. And the idea of, although I've been on lots of protests and I will yell online at racists all day, really, the fixing extremism doesn't happen there. There is nothing that I can do to sway that person in the same way that person isn't going to sway me, a bleeding heart lefty. The trick is to speak to people much younger and get to the heart and get to the source and go, well, how did you get here? How did you land here? Like the storyline for the proposed TV script was basically looking at those attitudes, and it goes 20 years into the past to understand, well, people don't just pop up here, they arrive, and there's a process. And it's always been my belief, even before I got embroiled in all of this stuff, I've always thought that it is catching people early and speaking to them as children or young people, or, you know, that impressionable age. You know, there's a lot of dialogue about impressionable young men at the moment. Catching people at that point is the answer. And I think that yelling at people and yelling at each other isn't the answer. As lovely as I love yelling at racists, it's one of my favorite things to do, but it doesn't move the needle. It doesn't. And so that is my answer. And maybe that's part of the games thing, right? Like, okay, you're not going to read my 2,000-word essay, but you might play the game. Give it a whirl. You know, we just have to keep pushing and keep trying.
Dan, thank you so much for such an incredible, inspiring way to finish today. Please give it up for Dan Hett.
Thank you all.